Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this very, very hot Saturday afternoon. We appreciate it. We're really excited to have two great authors here with us today. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Tammy Back. I'm the Director of Communications for William & Mary Libraries. And we've partnered with WRL to host this event today. A big thank you to everyone at the Williamsburg Regional Library, especially Melissa Simpson for working with us, and of course the director, Betsy Fowler, couldn't be here today. But we're really excited to have these kinds of programs for our community so that you can meet people who live and work and write right here in Virginia, so it's exciting. So before we begin, I'm going to introduce our moderator, and then she'll introduce our special guest speaker, and they'll have a conversation, and then we'll have a Q&A to follow, so you can ask any questions that you have. So first, Ellen Butler is the international best-selling author of the Karina Cardinal Mystery Series. Book critics have called this series an unputdownable adventures that will take readers on an electrifying yet lighthearted and humorous journey. Her next Karina Cardinal adventure, Spectral Revelations, takes place here in Williamsburg, and it's going to be released in October of this year. Exciting. Butler also writes, Ellen also writes historical spy fiction. Her World War II spy novel, The Brass Compass, recently won a Speak Up Talk Radio Firebird Book Award for historical fiction. Congratulations. The second book in the duology, Operation Blackbird, a Cold War spy novel, is Ellen's latest historical fiction, and is inspired by true events and won a first place Next Generation Indie Book Award for historical fiction. So we've got two great authors with us today, and I will pass it to Ellen. Thanks.
Hello, thank you, Tammy. I'm just honored to be here, and thank you all for coming out. I just wanted to say before we began, if anybody could just silence their phones so we don't have any embarrassing moments there. And I wanted to say thank you to Katharine for inviting me to participate in this event with her. So our special guest is Katharine Schellman, and she's a former actor and one-time political consultant. These days, she is writing the Lily Adler Mysteries and the Nightingale Mysteries, and her books, which reviewers have praised as worthy of Agatha Christie or Rex Stout. She gained a Library Journal starred review, which is very impressive, and she's received many accolades, including being named a Library Journal Best Crime Fiction of 2022, congratulations, a Suspense Magazine Best Book of 2020, and a New York Times editor's pick in June of 2022. Katharine lives and writes in the mountains of Virginia in the company of her husband, children, and the many houseplants she accidentally keeps murdering. So, Katharine.
Hello, Ellen.
I had the pleasure of getting an advance review copy of The Last Drop of Hemlock, which has this beautiful cover, and you can buy your copy outside afterwards and get Katharine to sign it. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask her a couple of questions about the book and about your writing a little bit.
All right.
So first, The Last Drop of Hemlock is the second book in the Vivian Kelly series, which takes place in New York City during Prohibition. Kind of what drew you to this Jazz Age time period, and what drew you to the New York City location?
I think the idea for the book sort of started in two places. My first series, the Lily Adler Mysteries, is also historical crime, but it's set in early 1800s in London, in England. And I wanted to do something that was set in the US. Just for a little variety, because I think mystery authors a lot of times have a habit of setting their books in the UK, because that's, if we start out reading Golden Age crime fiction, it's lots of British authors, and so that sort of sticks in our head as the setting that we gravitate towards a lot. But I think it's fun to branch out a little bit. So I wanted to do something that was set in the US, and I tend to start with characters when I'm writing, basically whenever I'm starting a new project. So the first character that occurred to me was Vivian. I knew right away that she was going to be working class, and that she was going to be a very different character from my first heroine, Lily Adler. And basically, given the character that popped into my head that I had in mind, really the only time she could have lived was in Jazz Age New York. And then that ended up being such a fun period of time to write about because of Prohibition and the way that affected a lot of aspects of particularly nightlife culture and the rise of organized crime and just a lot of fun things for a mystery author to play with, and just people dying all the time. So it gave me a lot of material to work with, and it ended up being a really fun setting for a mystery novel.
So I know that you have, obviously this is the second book. Are you planning a third and a fourth? How far do you think you're going to go with Vivian?
At least to 4. That's what we currently have planned, is 4 books. The third one is back in my hands right now. I had the first draft finished and sent to my editor, I guess, about 4 days before this one came out.
Great.
So that was book 3, and that's we're working on edits for that right now, and that'll come out next summer. And then the plan is 4th one the year after that, which will that be 2025? I can't count forward.
So 2020. So keep your eyes out, and she'll have more coming. Now, I know that as a historical fiction writer myself, you do a lot of research. We've talked a little bit about the fact that we're both kind of research junkies, and you get involved and you can go down rabbit holes for hours. So I know that you did a lot of research, clearly reading the book from into speakeasy life. So is The Nightingale actually inspired by a particular speakeasy in New York that you stumbled across in your research? Is it an amalgamation? Tell us a little bit about that.
It's more of an amalgamation, I think. There's not one in particular that really inspired me, because a lot of the speakeasies that would fall into sort of the category that The Nightingale is in are not things that we have a lot of individual records of. There were sort of three tiers of speakeasies that you would have gotten in the 1920s, particularly in cities. There would be the very wealthy ones, where they were basically very high-class clubs that were written about in newspapers and gossip columns, and socialites and politicians and movie stars would all congregate there, and there'd be these famous performers, and everyone knew that all kinds of illegal things were happening, but it didn't matter because everyone who was there was very wealthy and very high profile. And then at the full opposite end of the spectrum, you had essentially little hole-in-the-wall carts, even sometimes, where people would sell a tin can full of moonshine that was practically rat poison for just a few pennies, and if you didn't have a lot of money, you could take your chances on it and hope that you survived until morning. But in the middle were speakeasies that were, in a lot of ways, a lot like a bar or a club today. They were just a social place. People could go hang out, have a drink, go dancing, meet someone that you might get involved with romantically, or just spend time with your friends. And the biggest difference is just that they were very illegal because of Prohibition. But that was where the majority of people who were going out for that sort of nightlife experience would have ended up. And you got a huge cross-section of people at them, and that ended up making the most sense for a setting, and ended up giving me the most to play with. But it's the sort of thing where you get, in the historical record, a lot of information about that type of venue, but not specific ones being written up about, unless something very illegal or dangerous happened there. And it
came up in the newspapers,
yes.
Maybe. So actually, going back a little bit, the cast, I've noticed, in The Last Drop of Hemlock was very diverse, as New York City has been for a couple hundred years, and obviously you brought that into the book itself. Did your research lead you into incorporating that diversity naturally, or was it a conscious decision that on your part to create this diversity in the novel? Kind of, how did that formulate for you?
It's really a product of the research, I think. One of the things that was so unique about that sort of mid-level speakeasy culture is that you did get a huge cross-section of society there. You got people from a lot of different socioeconomic levels. You got people from a lot of immigrant versus recent immigrants versus not recent immigrants. You got people from all different racial backgrounds and religious backgrounds, because everything was illegal there. Like, that was what prompted that, because American society in the 1920s was deeply segregated by who had money and who didn't, who was white and who was not, who was, you know, a recent immigrant and who could trace their family back more generations. Like there were very strict divisions in who was living where, who was spending time with who, except in these speakeasy settings, because everything, it was already an illegal place to hang out. So all that mixing across all these different very taboo lines just became one more just very illicit and naughty thing that people would do as part of of their fun night out. And we do have historical records of that. One of my favorite quotes that I'm going to completely butcher right now was from a Chicago newspaper. I think the newspaper was the New Amsterdam News, and it was a newspaper from a black neighborhood in Chicago. And the columnist wrote that the nightclubs in our age have done more to improve race relations in the last decade than churches have done in the last 100 years. Because that was just a thing that people knew would happen. One of the terms that was used for them was called a black and tan. And that it was a speakeasy where you knew that you would get that kind of racial mixing and that kind of socioeconomic mixing. And that was just part of the fun for people. So once you find that in the research, it would be, I think, a real disservice to the time period not to incorporate it and not to show how that happened. And also the barriers to people who developed those relationships across those lines in their nightlife, but then what happens when you're out in the daytime world, yes, which is suddenly very different rules and very different expectations for how you're interacting with each other.
Right, and you did incorporate that somewhat in the book as well, I noticed, because I remember thinking, for you who have not read it, we have, you know, whites and African Americans and Chinese in this nightlife at the Nightingale. And I remember thinking at that time, that's very interesting. Did that really happen? So thank you for clearing that up, because as you can read it, yes, very true, it happened. That's one of the things I know we as historical fiction authors want to try and stay true to is our research, so that we don't have people writing us emails.
They still do, but
they do. So this is fun. As crime writers, we do a lot of research in ways to kill people, because sometimes people have to die. From this title, we obviously know that poison plays a role. So just tell us a little about how you decided on this particular killing method. And just tell us about that first.
Is it awful to say I needed a new way to kill someone? Like, after you write a few books, you have to get a little bit creative in how they start dying. But one of my favorite research sources, and this is a book that it's a weird recommendation, but I always love throwing it out there. It's called The Poisoner's Handbook. And it's a record of essentially famous poisoning crimes in the 1920s in New York City, and how the proliferation of accessible poisons at that time led to the creation of forensics as a field of study and as a way of investigating crime, and how that science developed and how it became part of the criminal justice system. And it's a fascinating read. It really reads more like a fiction, like fiction, because it's just like one case after another, and the hunt for each criminal and how they figured out how to diagnose how each crime happened.
In the early days of
yes,
forensic
of
studies.
Before it was an established science. It was really the creation of it as a science. And so that was one of my big inspirations for this, because when I was researching the first book, that was a book that ended up on my list, and I didn't end up using poison in the first book, so I knew that I wanted to use it in the second book. But you do, I mean, I'm sure you have this experience, you end up with all sorts of weird Google searches on your computer. Like, I would never want someone to subpoena my computer history.
I have a feeling they're already watching us.
Right.
You know,
there's some weird keyword combinations
NSA,
there.
I'm sure, is already tapping into my stuff.
Well, you end up having to Google things like, okay, what does someone look like after this particular type of poisoning, or after this particular type of crime? Because
how long does it take for someone to bleed out after cutting their femoral artery?
Yeah.
About a minute to a minute and a half.
Fun facts that we learned.
It's funny, because I'm actually doing a short story right now, and I'm doing research on poison. So I have not read the Poisoning Handbook, and I'm going to have to check that out.
It's real good.
Thank you.
Even outside of 1920s, I've used information from it for my other series also, just because there's There's a lot of universally applicable information in there.
Isn't
Hopefully
it
not like
fun
day
to
to day
hang out
though.
with crime writers? So, what is the strange? So we talked about things that you Googled. Tell us what the strangest or most oddball thing that you Googled for this novel in particular.
This one, I mean, it was probably like weird poisoning facts, but I think a lot of times especially when I'm getting into the nitty gritty of the writing, you just have to get so detailed about the things you're looking up. I mean, God bless all the archivists and librarians who are putting things online, because when you're writing something in a real historical setting and in a real setting, there's so many details that are almost the same as like the modern city, but just slightly different. So things like subway routes, or you know, how people would have moved from this part of the city to this part of the city. Yeah, so it's a lot of weird nitty gritty that you end up diving into. But yeah, all of the stuff about how to kill people. And how the police force worked, especially because
Yeah,
that
I
was
was
also
wondering,
a very different
because
thing
that's very different than today.
in the 1920s. Yeah, there was a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of corruption in the police force in the 1920s because so many people in high-profile positions were involved in the bootlegging industry.
Right.
Like that's how that industry ran. It was greased with a lot of bribes and a lot of favors and a lot of people in high places who had a financial stake in it. I had to do a lot of Googling about the mob, a lot of research about the mob in the 1920s. One fun fact that I found was that there was a point, sort of right in the middle of Prohibition, when Prohibition was really when organized crime became financially viable, because because everyone wanted a drink. So there was so much money to be made. And at one point, right in the middle of the 1920s, the yearly profit of organized crime was greater than the United States federal budget. Like it was that level of a moneymaker, which is why so many politicians were involved in it.
Exactly, there was money to be had. So let's talk a little bit about the character. I'd like to focus a little bit about the character of Vivian, and tell us about. I noticed that. And I want you to talk about it a little bit. I would say that she was bisexual. Why did you choose to give her this identity? And talk about a little bit about in your research and stuff, because that was a dangerous lifestyle in that time period, to have that incorporated in your book. So just talk about a little bit about and why you chose to go that direction with Vivian.
I think for me, it was part of it was a very personal decision, because I also identify as bisexual, so having a character that shared that identity was very meaningful to write about. But the 1920s, again, just lent itself really well to exploring a lot of those elements of, like, here is someone who has this identity, how does that affect their day-to-day life in these two very different worlds. You have the world of the nightlife and then their daytime life, because the 1920s was a time when, in a lot of ways, queer culture really entered the mainstream in nightlife. There were a lot of, and again, for a lot of the same reasons that you get sort of the socioeconomic mixing and the racial mixing and all of that, because everything was already very illicit, very naughty, and it's just this nightlife culture, the speakeasy culture, created a place for people to really have those kinds of relationships or explore those identities semi-publicly. You know, it's public, but it's in this very secret, protected setting where everyone is already being fairly secretive about who they are and what their daytime identity is. But there were a lot of, especially in certain areas of the city. In New York, it was particularly in the Village and in Harlem, there were a lot of speakeasies and clubs and dance halls that were known as safe places for queer folks to hang out. There were one of the big events in the New York social calendar in the 1920s. It was an event called a Masquerade and Civic Ball, which is essentially a giant drag ball. It started out as, you know, this part of, you know, queer culture that just spread, and it became this big annual event that people from all over the city, or even all over the country, would travel to come be part of. It just became like the cool, fun thing that people were doing. And it started in the late 1800s and lasted until the 1960s, I think. And but it was really in its heyday in the 1920s and 30s. And a lot of that had to do with the sort of speakeasy nightlife and that jazz age culture. Like, it just became this big, illicit, exciting, naughty thing that people could do. And things like that really helped queer culture enter the mainstream and create very safe places for people to explore those identities. But you're absolutely right that, as soon as you left that environment, it suddenly was not safe. Like,
right.
you could be with your partner at night, and you could be openly dancing with, as a same-sex couple at night. But as soon as you walked down the street in the daytime, you were separate. Like, you were not a couple anymore. And there was a lot of danger in trying to integrate those two halves of your life.
So it's kind of a double persona that you had to put on in the afternoon, in the daytime versus the nighttime.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about a little bit about your writing, the writing style and stuff and things like that. Talk about your writing style. Are you a plotter or are you a pantser? And for those who don't know, authors in author land, we have plotters, people who do a lot of writing. Maybe you plot each. I know some folks who plot every single chapter and moment by moment. And then we have pantsers who just head in with a general idea and you just start writing.
The idea is you're writing by the seat of your pants. That's where the term comes from. I think I tend to be more on the plotting side of things. The very first mystery that I ever wrote became The Body in the Garden, which is the first in my Lily Adler series. And that one I just started writing and kept writing until I got to the end. And so when you're writing a historical mystery, generally you're looking at around 100,000 words. This one, when I finished, was 145,000, which meant I had an entire second half. I had a third more book than I needed, basically, in there. So I had to cut that way, way down. And after that, I realized that I needed to actually plan things out a little bit more. So I tend to outline pretty thoroughly. I wouldn't say I have every detail in there. I tend to do basically a paragraph per scene, so that I know, if I'm starting here, this is what happens in this scene, and here's how I'm getting to the next scene. Here's the key information that I need for characters to discover here, so that then this can happen later, and that sort of thing. In a lot of ways, I think my outline's kind of my first draft. So things get moved around, and things change from that until the next draft. Things, I think you probably have a similar experience where things change up until you're published. The book comes out, basically. You're trying to change things until the last minute.
Like we talked about a little bit earlier today, we had lunch together, we were talking about it, and we said some of our best ideas come in the shower. And like you, I've had some ideas, and I say, oh, I need to go back and change that, which means I need to change that, and then forward this, and so. An
outline isn't foolproof. I think I have another book coming out in September, and that one, I wrote an outline, and I wrote a first draft, and then I didn't realize, basically until I got to the end of the first draft, like, it's all happening out of order. Like, even with the outline there, it still all needed to be shuffled around. So, there's always going to be edits that have to be done. But I like having a little more of a plan going in, so I know that the key information is there. And also so I can use my writing time a little better, just in terms of if I'm sitting down and I'm going to be working, I like to know what I am going to be working on, so that I can at least have something to show for it at the end of the hour or the 2 hours or whatever I have.
So speaking of that, when do you tend to write? Are you a morning? Some folks get up very early. I've got a girlfriend, literally she gets up 4 a.m., goes to the gym, and then writes from 5 to 7 o'clock in the morning, and then she gets her kids up, and then she goes to work. I don't know how she does it. She goes to bed at 8 o'clock.
I wish I were that organized, but I am not. If it's a day that is a work day for me, I tend to start as soon as my kids are out of the house and try to sit down and have, I tend to write in maybe hour chunks of time. So to write for an hour, take a break, write for another hour, do an errand, have lunch, whatever, but try to get a few big chunks of writing time in. Because I find, writing gives me decision fatigue, especially when I'm drafting. Every word is a choice. Every plot beat is a choice. Everything a character does or doesn't do is a choice. So after an hour, I need a break from making choices and making decisions. But yeah, I wish I had a better schedule. I think a lot of people have their writing rituals and their routine, and I do this on this day and this on this day, or this chunk of the day is always for drafting, and this chunk of the day is always for editing, and I think I'm a little more chaotic in how I spend my weeks. The day, when I have deadlines coming up, I'm very focused. You know,
Okay.
It's like sit down at the desk and get it all done, but that's...
So you don't have like a daily or a weekly word count? Like I have a weekly word count when I'm in the middle of it.
I often have a daily word count based on when a deadline is coming up.
Okay.
Right now I have a deadline in September, so I have a 2,000 a day word count that I'm trying to hit, knowing that there will be some days that I don't and some days that I get a little bit more of that, but trying to average out to 2,000 a day. But then I also have another book, the third Nightingale book that I just got back from my editor that I now need to do edits on too. So then just sort of juggling the two different projects. I feel like the day never goes quite as organized as I intend it to be, but you know, deadlines are very motivating.
Yes.
So things get done.
They definitely light a fire under you, don't they? So I'm going to take a few minutes to see if we have any audience questions at this time, and then see where we go from there. I have a couple more questions also, but does anybody have any questions about the book or Katharine's writing? Down here front? We have someone with a mic.
Do you self-publish, or do you have a hello. Hello. Do you self-publish, or do you have a publishing company, or how do your books get published?
Yeah, so I'm what we call traditionally published, which means I work with a publishing company. I actually have two publishers that I work with. So the Nightingale books are published by Minotaur, which is an imprint at Macmillan. And then my Lily Adler series is published by Crooked Lane, which is an independent publisher. So that means that I'm working with an agent and I'm working with a publishing house. And whereas as someone who's self-published has to do more of that work themselves. You know, they find their own editor, they find their own cover designer, they have to handle their publicity or hire a publicist. So for me, I kind of outsource all that.
Do we have any other?
As a former teacher, I'm curious, were you a writer as a child?
I was, yes. I think I was probably 6 years old when I first told my parents that I was going to write books when I grow up. And to their credit, they said, that sounds like a nice idea. But I don't know how serious they took it at that time. But yeah, I sort of always knew that I wanted to be writing eventually. I went through a phase of a few other things. As Ellen told you, I worked in political consulting for a little while. I worked as an actor for about 5.5 years, which I really enjoyed, but discovered was not what I wanted to be doing long term. But I always had it in the back of my head, sort of through all of that at some point I would be writing, and that would be my career. So I was always working on something. I think I have about, I would say probably 2.5 novels that no one will ever see, because they were just truly terrible. They were very good practice. I think everyone needs a lot of practice before you're ready to send a book out into the world. But I was always working on something, and eventually I was working on something that I decided I wanted to show to other people. But it took a little while to get to that point.
I'm always very thankful for editors.
Yes, I love the
Sometimes
editing
editors
process.
are like, well, you know, we could do it. I'm like, just say it. Just be, you know, because I'm very much one who I want that to come at me. I don't know about you, but when you got your first, you know, edit back from an editor, was it bleeding or did you want to cry? I've had friends call me up and I'm like, oh my God, I thought they liked my book and it's all over and I hate it. I'm like, first of all, have a glass of wine. And they're just trying to help you because everybody wants to put out the best book possible.
I actually love getting edits back. I don't always agree with them, but I've always really trusted the editors that I've worked with. So even when we have sort of a difference of opinion, I feel like we're able to have very productive conversations about it. But it's interesting you say that, because I'd never thought about this before, but I find it very easy to take that kind of feedback and not get too emotional about it. And now that I'm thinking about it, I grew up doing ballet, which is a very critical art form. You get a lot of feedback all the time from your instructors.
Very personal feedback.
It's very personal. It can be delivered very directly, shall we say, a little harshly sometimes, but the attitude is very much, If you're getting corrections, it means that the instructor was watching what you were doing, and that means that you were worth watching. So you have a very particular mindset that if someone is bothering to give you feedback, that's a good thing, because it means they thought you were worth getting feedback to. So that tends to be how I approach the editing process. I also much prefer editing to drafting. There is nothing more stressful for me than just having to stare at a blank page and try to figure out what's going to go on there, which is weird because that's a huge part of the job. It's a big part of it. But
starting, I think, is the hardest.
Yeah, so,
I can't tell you. Have you spent time rewriting and writing your first sentence?
Yes. And I finally got to the point where I will write the first sentence or write the first paragraph and then just say that's a placeholder. Mm-hmm. Because you always can come back and edit it some more, but you just want to get it just right to start. Yeah. So you can spend a long time just trying to write that first paragraph.
I've come back many times to rewrite the first part.
But you often don't know what the first sentence needs to be until you've gotten to the end of the book.
That's true.
Like you want the whole arc of it to work really well together, and you don't necessarily know what that whole arc is until you've gotten to the end of the arc. You don't know what's the right opener until you know what the journey you're taking the reader on is going to be.
That is a very good piece of advice. So anyone here looking to write a book, write that down.
Just ignore the beginning until you've written the end. That's my advice.
So do we have any more questions from the audience?
So I was wondering, I'm assuming you enjoy reading books since you write books, but since you write so much, do you get like burnt out from writing and reading, or do you feel like reading is like, it gives you more inspiration? And what kind of books do you like to read?
I think reading is one of the best kinds of inspiration for writers. I think even if you're not getting specific ideas, you are seeing how other people do the work that you're trying to do. And I think that's incredibly inspirational. I love seeing, for example, when you're writing historical fiction, so much of that you're crafting a world. You are building a world for the reader to be part of. And some of the best world builders out there, I think, are science fiction and fantasy writers. So I love seeing how they build their worlds and what information they will give and what they will sort of hint at and how they reveal, what makes their world all work together. So for example, that I think is really incredibly inspirational and informative. So I tend to read very widely. I read a lot of different genres. It depends on what mood I'm in, whether can I deal with a book that's a real bummer, or do I need something that's like really fun right now? I will say that when I am drafting, I cannot read in my own genre. If I'm working on writing a mystery, I cannot be reading a mystery. A lot of times I'll read nonfiction, or I'll read something that feels very different. Like I'll read a romance, or a sci-fi about like climate change, or something that's just radically different than what I am working on. And it's a very nice sort of brain break, I think. But yes, what about you? I think reading widely is...
I do read widely. When I'm in the middle of writing a novel, like you, I tend not to read in my genre. I'll read, I'm in a couple of book clubs, so I'll read the book club book, and I'll read the nonfiction that is focused on whatever. So if I'm writing my historical fiction, I'll be reading some World War II or whatever, spy books, that sort of thing. But I don't read as much when I'm in the middle of it. Mm-hmm. Right now, I'm working on some short stories, so I have more time to do reading, and so I probably just did a couple of books in the past month or so. But in the midst of it, and also kids and school and life and work, so.
Having a life is occasionally nice.
But I do like the summer. It does let up for me in the summer. Mm-hmm. I don't know, do you get more reading done in the summertime, or is it busier? I mean, right now you get the release, and so that's a lot. Mine tend to release either in spring or fall, so.
I think it really goes in cycles for me. I think it's not so much dependent on what else is going on, but just how much time I'm making for it, and how whether I've found something that's really, I think if you find a book that you're really into, you make time to read it, even if things are really busy. So if I've found that book, I tend to be very focused, and just whatever else I'm doing, I'll get through that so I can get back to the book that I'm reading. Or if I'm reading things that are a little slower paced, then I tend to, I'll read a few pages today and I'll read a few pages tomorrow. But yeah.
Do you ever feel it's a guilty pleasure?
No, 100% no. I don't think I feel guilty about reading anything.
I do sometimes when things are on my pile of to do, like the laundry or whatever that you have. And sometimes I do feel, I'm like, oh, I shouldn't be reading. And so I'll literally go and hide in my bedroom. My husband will be like, what are you doing? Nothing. What do you need? I don't know why. I don't know why, because he doesn't make me feel guilty about it at all. But
there's that sense of there's other things I could be
I
doing.
think that's what it is. It's that sense of I could or I should be doing other things. But
I just tell myself
that there's only 10 more pages. There's only 2 more. Or let me just finish this chapter.
I tell myself it's part of work.
This is true. That's my argument there. Do we have any other more questions from the audience? Right down front.
You may not, is it on? It is,
Yeah.
Okay. You may not have a favorite character to write as, so I don't want to assume, but if you had to pick a favorite character to write as, so if you're doing the dialogue or whatever, what's your favorite character's head to step into?
Probably, especially in this series, I think the sort of semi-antagonists, not necessarily like the ones who are killing people, but the ones who are, I don't want to say anything too spoilery, but there's a particular mob boss that Vivian continually encounters and sort of cross paths with, and she's so much fun to write because she's such a morally gray character. She's not outright terrible and evil, but she's also not really a good person. So it's just very fun to be in that mindset and to be writing that character. And again, the 1920s gives you a lot of that to explore. My other series, the Lily Adler mysteries, they're much more straightforward, sort of whodunit. You know who the bad guys are, and you know who the people you're supposed to be rooting for are. Whereas the Nightingale books, there's a lot more gray area in terms of, well, I know that these are my protagonists, but they're not always making good choices. Or I know that these are my villains, but maybe this person had a reason for doing what they did. So there's a lot more to play with there, which is a lot of fun.
That is a good character. I like that character. I know who you're talking about. She was interesting. Do we have any other questions?
In doing the research you described, did you have any fun aha moments where you said this would be great to have in the story, things that you found in real life that you could incorporate? And then my second question is, I always think that exercise is great in learning about a place and getting to know it and what makes it unique. And how do you choose what places for the novel and which is your next one? And is that an important aspect of it for you, the placeness of it?
I think, so I'm going to do the second question first. I think absolutely yes. I think for these books, I think of New York as being another character in the books because it has especially in this time period, has such a specific vibe and such a specific feel to it. Or at least I hope it does. That's my goal in the book. So
it's very alive, yes.
Before I started writing, I actually did before I started writing the first one, I did a trip to New York with a friend of mine, and we spent a couple days just walking around the city and going to locations or parts of the city that I sort of wanted to be in the books, both so I could see them, but also so I could get the feel of, okay, if I am moving from this place to this place, what is that like in someone's day? If you're doing this on foot, if you're doing it with a cab, if you're just having that experience of being in the city. That was a really fun way to sort of jumpstart the project and get in that headspace. But yeah, I think the setting in these books in particular, not as much in my other series, but in these books in particular, it's very much part of the story and part of the characters and their lives. For your first question about the weird historical facts, I think there's so many, and we were talking about this a little bit before, there's so many that you come across that you almost can't even put in the book because they seem too weird. Or they're so fun and bizarre, but they would take people out of it because they'd be like, really? Is that
too far-fetched?
Is that a thing? So one of my I guess my favorite category for this this series is weird ways that people got around Prohibition. And there were so many strange ones. One of my favorite is that basically mobsters, basically mob bosses, would buy or rent these giant cruise ships and load them up in New York Harbor and then sail them out to international waters, where they would then meet with another ship that brought in cases of booze. And people would just stay out on the ship in international waters where it wasn't illegal for 2 or 3 days just drinking and partying. It was like the original booze cruise. So that continues on in lovely spring break tradition to this day. But
it's legal at least.
Yeah, but that's how that was one of the ways they got around that law. You could be prescribed medicinal alcohol by a doctor, but it didn't necessarily have to be a doctor for humans. So a vet could prescribe you medicinal alcohol. There was a company called Vino Sano that would ship, and they'd advertise in newspapers that you could buy these things. It was very, very public and they were not secretive about it at all, but you could buy these bricks of dehydrated grape juice that they would ship around the country, and they would arrive with step-by-step instructions for how not to turn it into wine. So, don't do this, then don't do this, then don't do this. And because it was how not to do it, it was technically legal, even though everyone knew exactly what it was for. So it's just so many things like that I want to put in there, but I feel like there's no way to sneak it in there without being completely jarring.
Dehydrating food at that time was a thing.
Yes, they could at least do it with grape juice. Someone figured it out.
Wine. The secret wine.
Mm-hmm.
That is very interesting.
So I'm always trying to figure out how to slip those things in there, but then I don't want to then have a character have to give a 3-paragraph explanation of what this thing actually means, because that takes you out of the story way too much. But it's so hard not to put them in there. Like, maybe I just need to have them go on a booze cruise in the next book.
Well, you do have to be careful, because I did have an editor. Actually, it wasn't even an editor. It was a beta reader. That's someone that you might establish beta readers to friends or other authors to read your books before you even give it to an editor to give you feedback on what you're doing. And I gave my first historical fiction to a beta reader, and I said, there's something wrong. I can't figure out what it is. Can you read it for me? She was an author too. And she sent it back, and she said, you've allowed your research to take away from the story. Basically, I just got too involved. Because I would have a couple of paragraphs in the research that I'd done, just because you do it, and you're like, oh, this is so cool. And you start writing it. You try and write your character into it, and really all it's doing is taking away from the story or slowing down your flow. So
I think between the first draft and the second draft, there's a lot of fun facts that get cut, basically.
It's kind of sad, isn't it?
It
You're
is
like,
a little
this
bit.
is so cool. Delete, delete, delete.
It is, and you know them, and then we get to share them at times like this, which is really nice. So thank you for asking that question.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions out from the audience we can think of? Well, Katharine, thank you for being my guest here at the Williamsburg Regional Library. I'll be here next week. And it's been just a pleasure. I enjoyed reading The Last Drop of Hemlock, and I look forward to the next Vivian Kelly novel, and maybe we'll be back in a year or so talking about the next one. Thank you, audience, for coming. I think this has been just really enjoyable to learn more about Katharine's writing and her books.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you, everyone, for coming.